So we're back again with the Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, Part 2. The nurse and Miss Rosamond, the young baby, have been taken to live in a cottage on the Furnivall estate up in Northumberland, and we'll see what happens next in this next edition of the Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, part of the Ghosts of Christmas Past Resurrected event hosted by Vin from Revenant Reads and some wonderful co-hosts. Let's continue. The afternoon was closing in, and the hall, which had no fire lighted in it, looked dark and gloomy, but we did not stay there a moment. The old servant who had opened the door for us bowed to Mr. Henry and took us in through the door at the further side of the great organ, and led us through several smaller halls and passages into the west drawing-room, where he said that Mrs. Furnivall was sitting. Poor little Miss Rosamond held very tight to me, as if she were scared and lost in that great place, and as for myself, I was not much better. The west drawing-room was very cheerful looking, with a warm fire in it, and plenty of good, comfortable furniture about. Miss Furnivall was an old lady, not far from 80, I should think, but I do not know. She was thin and tall, and had a face as full of fine wrinkles as if they had been drawn all over it with a needle's point. Her eyes were very watchful, to make up, I suppose, for her being so deaf as to be obliged to use a trumpet. Sitting with her, working at the same great piece of tapestry, was Mrs. Stark, her maid and companion, and almost as old as she was. She had lived with Miss Furnivall ever since they both were young, and now she seemed more like a friend than a servant. She looked so cold and grey and stony, as if she had never loved nor cared for anyone, and I don't suppose she did care for anyone except her mistress, and owing to the great deafness of the latter, Mrs. Stark treated her very much as if she were a child. Mr. Henry gave some message from my lord, and then he bowed goodbye to us all, taking no notice of my sweet little Miss Rosamond's outstretched hand, and left us standing there, being looked at by the two old ladies through their spectacles. I was right glad when they rung for the old footman who had shown us in at first, and told him to take us to our rooms. So we went out of that great drawing-room and into another sitting-room, and out of that, and then up a great flight of stairs, and along a broad gallery, which was something like a library, having books all down one side, and windows, and writing tables all down the other, till we came to our rooms, which, I was not sorry to hear, were just over the kitchens, for I began to think I should be lost in that wilderness of a house. There was an old nursery that had been used for all the little lords and ladies long ago, with a pleasant fire burning in the grate, and the kettle boiling on the hob, and tea things spread out on the table, and out of that room was the night nursery, with a little crib for Miss Rosamond close to my bed. And old James called up Dorothy, his wife, to bid us welcome, and both he and she were so hospitable and kind that by and by Miss Rosamond and me felt quite at home, and by the time tea was over, she was sitting on Dorothy's knee and chattering away as fast as her little tongue could go. I soon found out that Dorothy was from Westmoreland, and that bound her and me together, as it were, and I would never wish to meet with kinder people than were old James and his wife. James had lived pretty nearly all his life in my lord's family, and thought there was no one so grand as they. He even looked down a little on his wife, because, till he had married her, she had never lived in any but a farmer's household. But he was very fond of her, as well he might be. They had one servant under them to do all the rough work. Agnes, they called her, and she and me and James and Dorothy, with Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark, made up the family, always remembering my sweet little Miss Rosamond. I used to wonder what they had done before she came. They thought so much of her now. Kitchen and drawing-room. It was all the same. The hard, sad Miss Furnivall and the cold Mrs. Stark looked pleased when she came fluttering in like a bird, playing and pranking hither and thither with a continual murmur and pretty prattle of gladness. I am sure they were sorry many a time when she flitted away into the kitchen, though they were too proud to ask her to stay with them, and were a little surprised at her taste, though to be sure, as Mrs. Stark said, it was not to be wondered at, remembering what stock her father had come of. The great old rambling house was a famous place for little Miss Rosamond. She made expeditions all over it with me at her heels, all except the east wing, which was never opened, and whither we never thought of going. But in the western and northern part, as many was many a pleasant room, full of things that were curiosities to us, though they might not have been to people who had seen more. The windows were darkened by the sweeping boughs of trees and the ivy which had overgrown them, but in the green gloom we could manage to see old china jars and carved ivory boxes and great heavy books, and above all, the old pictures. Once, I remember, my darling would have Dorothy go with us to tell us who they all were, for they were all portraits of some of my lord's family, though Dorothy could not tell us the names of every one. We had gone through most of the rooms when we came to the old state drawing-room over the hall, and there was a picture of Miss Furnivall, or, as she was called in those days, Miss Grace, for she was the younger sister. Such a beauty she must have been, but with such a set, proud look, and such scorn looking out of her handsome eyes, with her eyebrows just a little raised, as if she wondered how anyone could have the impertinence to look at her, and her lip curled at us as we stood there gazing. She had a dress on, the like of which I had never seen before, but it was all the fashion when she was young, a hat of some soft white stuff like beaver, pulled a little over her brows, and a beautiful plume of feathers sweeping round it on one side, and her gown of blue satin was open in front to a quilted white stomacher. Well, to be sure, said I, when I had gazed my fill, flesh is grass, they do say, but who would have thought that Miss Furnivall had been such an out-and-out beauty, to see her now? Yes, said Dorothy, folks change sadly, but if what my master's father used to say was true, Miss Furnivall, the elder sister, was handsomer than Miss Grace. Her picture is here somewhere, but if I show it you, you must never let on, even to James, that you have seen it. Can the little lady hold her tongue, think you? Asked she. I was not so sure, for she was such a little, sweet, bold, open-spoken child, so I set her to hide herself, and then I helped Dorothy to turn a great picture that leaned with its face towards the wall and was not hung up as the others were. To be sure, it beat Miss Grace for beauty, and I think for scornful pride too, though in that matter it might be hard to choose. I could have looked at it an hour, but Dorothy seemed half frightened at having shown it to me, and hurried it back again, and bade me run and find Miss Rosamond, for there were some ugly places about the house where she would like ill for the child to go. I was a brave, high-spirited girl, and thought little of what the old woman said, for I liked hide-and-seek as well as any child in the parish, so off I ran to find my little one. As winter drew on and the days grew shorter, I was sometimes almost certain that I heard a noise as if someone was playing on the great organ in the hall. I did not hear it every evening, but certainly I did very often, usually when I was sitting with Miss Rosamond after I had put her to bed, and keeping quite still and silent in the bedroom. Then I used to hear it booming and swelling away in the distance. The first night, when I went down to my supper, I asked Dorothy who had been playing music, and James said very shortly that I was a gawk to take the wind soughing among the trees for music. But I saw Dorothy look at him very fearfully, and Bessie, the kitchen maid, said something beneath her breath, and went quite white. I saw they did not like my question, so I held my peace till I was with Dorothy alone. Then I knew I could get a good deal out of her. So the next day I watched my time, and I coaxed and asked her who it was that played the organ, for I knew that it was the organ and not the wind well enough, for all I had kept silent before James. But Dorothy had had her lesson, I'll warrant, and never a word could I get from her. So then I tried Bessie, though I had always held my head rather above her, as I was evened to James and Dorothy, and she was little better than their servant. So she said I must never tell, and if I ever told, I was never to say she had told me. But it was a very strange noise, and she had heard it many a time, but most of all on the winter nights, and before storms, and folks did say it was the old lord playing on the great organ in the hall, just as he used to do when he was alive. But who the old lord was, or why he played, and why he played on stormy winter evenings in particular, she either could not or would not tell me. Well, I told you I had a brave heart, and I thought it was rather pleasant to have that grand music rolling about the house. Let who would be the player, for now it rose above the great gusts of wind, and wailed and triumphed just like a living creature, and then it fell to a softness most complete. Only it was always music and tunes, so it was nonsense to call it the wind. I think we'll stop there, don't you? I'll be back soon with part 3. I hope you're enjoying it. Do take care, everybody. Bye bye.